Hey everybody, this is JDGaming back today with a deck profile of my Knightmare plants. So, a lot of people are giving Knightmares a lot of hype in the competitive scene, but honestly, it was just an archetype of Link monsters that I looked at in 𝗼𝗇 and I thought, what if I just threw together all this old special summoning synchro spam type of stuff together and adapted it to some of these Link monsters instead. So this is pretty much my new version of that Plant Hyperlink deck. If you saw that before, that was entirely built on Dandylion. Obviously Dandelion's now forbidden, and for good reason, because in this type of a strategy it would be absolutely nuts. But looking back into the history of the game, I was able to find literally just cards lying around that I used to have for old decks like Plant Synchro's 𝗵𝗿𝖇𝑑𝖑𝖊𝖓 and 𝕮𝖆𝖇𝖑 from 𝕮𝖵𝖇𝖑, and it's actually working quite nicely as just a supplementary way to get extra monsters onto the field, and we can bring out some old favorites like 𝗏𝗏𝐵, some new stuff like the Link monsters, and this is a lot of fun to play if you enjoyed any of those really fast-paced, extra deck-centric strategies. Anyhow, this is going to be a let's build like always, so I'm going to go through and explain all my choices, why things are in here, what things I might have considered instead, and then what kind of room you have for flexibility and customization, because realistically, I built this deck, again, just based on things I had lying around, and I'm sure you guys have some other cards that you like playing that have the ability to generate this type of summoning power as well, and you can always feel free to try mixing and matching these things together. There's not necessarily a set rule of how you have to do things, but this is just my take. If you just want to see the alphabetical profile that you're probably used to, then you can go ahead and click the timestamp in the description box down below. That'll take you right to the end of the video where everything is laid out for you in normal order, and then if you have any questions after that, you can always come back to the middle of the video where I explain in depth all of that information I talked about before. So without further ado, let's build Knightmare plants. As always, the first step is going to be talking about the theme and what our ultimate goal is here. And for our core, it's really important for us to talk about the new Link monsters that came out in Flames of Destruction. So I'll go in order of highest Link rating downward, and it'll make a bit more sense when we get down there. I'll give you a little more idea of how they work. But they all follow three patterns. So they all need 2 or more monsters with different names, except for your 𝗵𝗍, which is your main deck monster, 𝗵𝗍𝖊𝗓, and your Mermaid, which is a Link 1, which obviously won't need 2 monsters. Then they follow 2 effects, so they have a discard effect where something happens. If it's co-linked at the time of summoning, you get to draw a card to replace that, which is pretty nice. You don't lose anything in the process, and you can even set up some nice discard things in the graveyard. And then some sort of a continuous effect that basically bestows you either protection or other form of disturbance or support. So, following that pattern, we have a Knightmare Griffin here. It's basically Firewall Dragon, but it's a fiend. Again, just needs 2 or more monsters to summon, which is very easy to do. And it has the 2 same pattern of abilities. So discard a card, and you can go and take a spell or trap in your grave and recycle it by setting it onto your board. And you can't use it that turn, but you can use a trap card during your opponent's turn. Or you can use a card like Soul Charge during your next turn as a backup play, or to really blow your opponent out of the water. So very powerful effect. And especially that trap card aspect is very important to note for that defensive disturbance tactic, because its continuous effect is any monster that is not linked to a monster when it's special summoned cannot activate its effects. That means no chance of activating at all, can't even pay costs or anything that might help you set something up. And that's really powerful, because if you think about the definition of linked, it means anytime a link arrow is involved. So if I summon a monster here, that monster is linked to the Griffin, and Griffin is linked to this monster. But if you summon this over in the middle zone or the end zones in the extra monster zones, then they don't have, a free extra monster zone to summon into, or, as long as you don't summon into the extra monster zones as well, they don't have any of their own main monster zones to actually use those arrows to gain the ability to use their effects. So in this deck, you're really aiming to summon it in one of those 3 spots, and if you do that, your opponent will have a lot more trouble getting over this than if you just go Firewall with a single monster a lot of the time. So very powerful new card. Then we have Unicorn at Link 3, same pattern again for summoning, and then the discard cost is kind of like Castel. You target any card on the field, face up or face down, which is better than Castel, and spin it back into the deck, which is very powerful removal after the fact. It's got 2200 attack, which is pretty sizable, but sometimes your opponent has a bigger monster. This will help you get rid of that, or you can even clear back rows that are face up or face down. And then its continuous ability lets you draw a card during your draw phase instead of your normal draw. and you get 1 for each Knightmare monster with a different name anywhere on the field. That's both players' sides of the field. That's every single monster you and your opponent have together. Very powerful way to easily draw like 3 or more cards in a single turn, because realistically in a Knightmare deck, you're going to be summoning so many Link monsters, most of which are the Link 2s we'll get to in a second, and you're going to have a lot of different names. So really important to keep that in mind. This one does require co-linking for that extra draw effect, so no using the main deck monster 𝗵𝗍𝖊𝗍 or anything, but still a very, very powerful card overall. Then we have these 3 I like talking about together for a few reasons. Obviously, they're all the Link 2s, which means, you know, kind of makes sense to talk about these together. But I also like the fact that their effects kind of work together, and I have a quick mnemonic that'll help you guys remember them. So basically, we have 3 here. We have Phoenix, Goblin, and �11, and all of them follow the same type of discard pattern and summoning pattern as well. �11 and Phoenix have kind of the L and J shapes. If you're like, you know, a Tetris person, you might think of it that way, for Link arrows, and they have a similar effect to mirror that. So the dog kills cards, monster cards, anything that has been special summoned into the main monster zone, you're able to discard a card and pop it. And then the Phoenix, your bird, you know, if you think of Phoenix of Nephthys or Harpy's Feather Duster, those kill spells and traps. And wouldn't you know, Phoenix kills a spell or trap your opponent has. So it could be a face down card, it could be a continuous card that's face up, it could be a field spell, whatever. You're able to get rid of that. So that's pretty good. And then Goblin's additional effect, you know, he's kind of the odd one out with different arrows there. And discarding a card lets you go and get an additional normal summon to one of the zones he points to. So there was some confusion with this card because the Konami article that introduced it happened to mistake the word also with "and if you do," the phrase that they use on some of the cards. So also means it's an additional effect, but it's completely separate and doesn't have to happen together. You know, and if you do means you do one then the other. Also just means 2 things happen. So basically, if it's co-linked, yeah, you draw a card to replace that discard. But regardless, if you've discarded a card, you get an additional normal summon or set to the zones that he points to. So basically, let's say you want, you know, �11 first, you summon this, you could discard a card, you better use this zone here first to summon an additional time. Then you can turn something into, you know, your bird or whatever, your Phoenix, and then you'll be able to continue with your plays from there. On that note, it's also important to realize that Gem Knight, Seraph Knight, you know, Aromage Jasmine, you know, those types of additional normal summon effects that are not called double summon all fall into the same category if you can't gain that type of an effect once per turn. So if you've used that type of effect already, then yeah, you are limited to using that Goblin only once and not the other guys, or vice versa, the other things and not Goblin. So just do keep that in mind. It does come up every so often in this deck in particular. But then it's time to talk about the protection effects. So this is where the mnemonics come in, right? So all of them, while co-linked, protect co-linked monsters from a certain kind of removal or other damaging effect. So Bird blocks battle destruction. Goblin, which I think of as a troll, stops targeting, and �11, or dog, stops destruction by card effects. So that's kind of the quick way I like to remember it. All of them bestow protection effects, but again, bird blocks battle, troll stops targeting, and then dog or �11 stops destruction by card effects is the easiest way I could come up with to remember them. And I mean, technically speaking, these all do have different attributes as well, but realistically, that won't be so much of an important thing to know in all situations as it is to really know what these cards do if you play against them, even if you choose not to run them. And then the last 2 cards we're talking about go together as well. So it is the Link 1 Knightmare Mermaid with a downward arrow towards you, and Knightmare Corruptor 𝗵𝗍𝖊𝗍, which is the only main deck monster. And so Knightmare Mermaid is a bit different in that you have to use a Knightmare monster in order to summon it. And since 𝗵𝗍𝖊𝗍 is the only main deck monster, unless you're running 3 of her, which like no one does essentially at this point anyway, it's gonna be pretty hard to go and summon your mermaid as a 1-for-1. So you may be looking at that and thinking, huh, that's kind of odd. Like, why would I pay a Link 2, 3, or 4 even to make a mermaid? Well, first of all, its continuous effect reduces any non-co-linked monster's attack and defense by 1,000, which doesn't seem like a lot, but you gotta realize, you know, even cards like Forbidden Lance back in the day that were able to reduce attacks and decide battles only did 800, and that was a huge debuff. So if you're able to do 1,000 on everything, that's a pretty significant change, especially considering all of your guys are going to be co-linked most likely. On top of that, the fact that she only has a downward arrow means it fits perfectly into the extra linking theme of the Knightmares, because you'll be able to seal off that extra monster zone after you've summoned something else there, and you'll be able to stop your opponent from building their extra monsters anywhere. And then the last thing that really matters is that discard effect, which ties it together with 𝗵𝗍. So you can discard a card, of course replace it if you have it co-linked, to summon then a Knightmare monster from your main deck, which again is only 𝗵𝗍 at this point, but then 𝗵𝗍 has 3 effects that make it worth it as well. But even without considering any of her bonus effects, you have to realize you turn a Link 2, most likely, into a monster with another monster. You have to discard, but you draw a card, so then that doesn't matter in anything. You get basically a Link 2 becomes 2 cards, so same overall benefit there. But then 𝗵𝗍 has a few effects. If she's summoned through a normal summon, then you get a bonus effect if she's Debris Dragon, and you can link something to her from your graveyard. Blanket, so it has 0 attack and defense, and its effects are negated. But that would be something like, I just used this Knightmare Phoenix. It's in the graveyard. I can now normal summon this, and then boop, it's pointing towards the 𝗵𝗍, so then that's a legal way of placing this card. And then now I can go in and link this up into a Link 3 or whatever. So pretty good for making those types of plays. But then on top of that, anytime she's sent to the graveyard, including after she was special summoned with Mermaid, you can go and put her on your opponent's side of the field. Why would you ever want to do that? Why would you give your opponent an extra monster in Link era? Well, she has a continuous effect that stops anyone who's controlling her from doing any special summon that's not a Link summon. So if you're able to build the extra Link with her, you're able to go ahead and summon this to your opponent's side of the field. They can't drop any kaijus on you, and they can't do any other summons. If you blocked off the extra monster zones by extra linking, they can't summon anything from their extra deck, essentially. And again, it does stop the summoning of anything that's not a Link monster. I think I accidentally said Link summon. That's not exactly true. You can bring back Link monsters with like Monster Born or something, but your opponent's probably not going to have that. And even if they do, I mean, they wouldn't have a zone to summon into, assuming you're getting your goal of extra linking. But 3 powerful effects there: revive, summon into your opponent's side of the field, revive your own guy upon summon, and of course the lock you out for a moment, but then you use her as material and then lock your opponent out of the game. So those are the Knightmares. The next part of the video is probably going to make me sound a little bit more like a broken record, but this is just the part of the deck where it just makes too much sense to play these cards, and it doesn't make sense to not play the cards. So we are playing plants here, and the Participlants engine is going to help us with our 𝗣𝗍𝖑𝖊𝖓 play to essentially kick off everything. So just to briefly go through it real quick, you discard a card off of this to summon one of your �11𝖇𝖑𝖊𝖓𝐿𝐵𝑟s from your deck, which once per duel lets you go and add a fusion spell when it's summoned, so you go and add Brilliant Fusion. That will let us go and send one of our 2 garnets to the grave. Then it lets us summon Seraph Knight off of one of our light monsters. And I like playing 1 Trick Clown because it'll come back to the field instantly, and 1 Damage Juggler because we can banish it from the grave to summon out, or search out rather, our Hat Tricker, who summons itself for free if you have 2 or more monsters anywhere on the field. It could be even your opponent has both monsters, your opponent has one and you have another. So all of that stuff is in here for 𝗣𝗍𝖑𝖊𝖓, which basically breaks normal game conventions and deck building conventions, where I can now easily play a pair of Garnets, and I can play a pair of �11𝖇𝖑𝖊𝖓𝐵𝗓, and I don't even worry about that because all of these cards can just be shuffled away, and then 𝗣𝗍𝖑𝖊𝖓 lets me draw new cards instead with its powerful draw 4 effect. On top of that, the reason I really like playing the 3 Hat Trickers is 𝗣𝗍𝖑𝖊𝖓 has a special summon effect, which makes it really easy to put together some dumb combos using our Lone Fire Blossom, which of course lets us tutor out any plant from our deck. But that's really powerful because we can go and summon our �11𝖓𝐿 Scorpio to ensure that we get the combo off, and it can also let us go for things like Glow Up Bulb or Spore. But I especially like the Glow Up Bulb here because if you think of the Garnet, you think of the Hat Tricker. All of those are Earth monsters, and so that actually lets us go for level 1 Earth Tuner plus level 4 Earth Tuner is Naturia Beast, which of course lets us go and stop our opponent from using spell cards on top of all those Knightmare shenanigans I talked about earlier. So very annoying card that you can easily place like out here maybe or something. Because of 𝗣𝗍𝖑𝖊𝖓's arrows, or I guess if you play in the left zone, then it'd be over here. But thanks to those arrows, you're able to make it take advantage of that. Most games are able to do this because Glow Up Bulb is searchable by your Lone Fire Blossoms, and then all these other cards like 1-for-1, and Foolish Burial. But on top of that, you also have powerful access to your Hat Tricker as a level 4 monster because of that damage juggler who serves as your additional light monster. And then in this deck in particular, since I needed more cards to fill up the deck, literally I'm playing 1 Instant Fusion as a backup. Sometimes you draw Brilliant Fusion. If you draw extras, it's not an issue because you'll just be able to shuffle them away with 𝗣𝗆𝖇𝖑𝗊. But I would like to make the most out of every card I get, and having a single Instant Fusion in here with a 𝗣𝗔𝖄𝖄 Warrior basically lets you go and turn your 𝕮𝖆𝖇𝖑𝖊𝖓 into Instant Fusion, so you have 2 live cards. You already have your Instant Fusion, or your Brilliant Fusion, you play that. Search Instant Fusion, you can play that. Or even if you end up shuffling this away, hey, it's still a nice opportunity that you have in this deck. Is it worth the extra deck slot? Honestly, I didn't miss it that much. This is just an Earth monster that's level 4, so it basically lets me make Gnatbeast even more easily. Is it required to help you make Gnatbeast? Not really. My brother was actually going through and saying you could play like a Fright for Sheep, and that would just be an annoying recursive monster that you could use if you use Soul Charge or anything later. Like, there are a lot of options that you really have in that slot, but basically you need that Predaplant engine that will get you 𝗣𝗆𝖇𝖑𝗊𝖓, and once you make 𝗣𝗆𝗇𝖑𝗊𝖓, you don't care if you play 2 of your Garnets and 𝕮𝖆𝖇𝖑𝗊𝖓𝖑s, you know, you're able to go draw more cards, get everything you need for the next part of the deck. And I know we had a long discussion at the beginning introducing the Knightmares for the first time on this channel, but the rest of this deck, as you're probably noticing, is just as fast as this deck, because we're already almost done. The next chunk for fleshing out the main is going to be 3 copies of Reborn Tengu and 3 Destiny Hero Malicious, which basically are monsters that give you 2 additional monsters when you play them, which is really awesome. Obviously, Malicious is something that ends up in the graveyard a lot because you can discard it with the Predaplant 𝗆𝗓 or off of 1-for-1, or even Foolish Burial, which finally Foolish Burial has something really nice that pluses you in terms of just raw card advantage in this deck, which is very, very nice. But essentially, you know, these give you just additional firepower. It's a warrior dark and a beast warrior wind, so a lot of times you're able to go for weird monsters like 𝗵𝗐, who fits right in the bill as like a co-linking monster that bestows additional protection to little guys. Overall, they're very powerful cards. You can special summon them immediate with 𝗣𝗆𝖇𝖑𝗊𝒑, even the Malicious, which is quite nice. You can extra normal summon them with either Goblin or Seraph Knight. These are very powerful cards. You want to see them. And originally I was like, it might clog if you play 3 and 3 of these things, but realistically, they're going to help you more than not, especially because, again, 𝗣𝗆𝖇𝖑𝗊𝒓 can shuffle away all the extras that you don't need as long as you can make him, and this deck is going to be geared towards making sure we get that initial 𝗣𝗆𝖇𝖑𝗊𝒓 play. So to help make sure that happens, we have 3 copies of Goblinberg. So basically, if you draw your 𝗆𝗓 Scorpio or your Lone Fire Blossom, you just use this first, and then you have an additional monster, which makes it even easier for you to go and get to the 4 different names that you need. It also happens to be an Earth monster, so yay, we can go for Naturia Beast even more easily. And then in weird applications, remember that this thing has this stepwise effect where you normal summon it, and if you do, then you can special summon 1 level 4 or lower monster from your hand, then change this to defense, and then change this to defense is a separate part of the effect, which means your opponent's window for hitting you with like Torrential Tribute or whatever is gone until you've already summoned that extra monster, and then they can't respond to that monster. So little application, but you know, ABCs are running around despite Ancient Fury getting hit. I still think they're pretty good. So if they're around, you know, you'll see Torrential. If you're seeing Lilith decks, you'll see Torrential. So it might be a good thing to know how you get around that card so you can establish a strong board first that cannot be killed by Torrential. And then 1 copy of this. I love this thing. It's like red-haired hasty horse, and basically if you have an open column that's not occupied between you or your opponent's zones, you just drop it into that zone as a free 2000 monster. I really never attack with this thing. It does have my attack, and I can attack directly once effect, which is pretty cool because it can do 1000 to end the game. But realistically, this is just a free monster you can summon once per turn. So I play the 1 copy, so if you draw it, boom, extra monster with a different name from everything. It's a beast wind, so it's a different type and attribute from everything as well, which is pretty darn cool. And then this thing is more of like you can take advantage of that extra normal summon off of the Seraph Knight or Goblinberg or 𝗣𝗆𝖇𝖑𝗊𝒓 or whatever. But basically, Steam the Cloak has been seeing some popular discussion thanks to Lair of Darkness. Anytime this card leaves the field, you get to summon a Steam token. So usually I'll just go and, you know, boop, one of these guys here. And then that can be used as a link material. So you basically go, you have one Steam the Cloak. You use him as a link material, you get a token and a link monster, and then you can go and tribute any monster. It could be the token, could be the link monster, could be anything else you have, maybe a Tengu or a Malicious, right? And it'll be a free summon. You can, once per duel, bring this guy back from the graveyard. So let's say you did that, and then you use this guy again, you spawn another token, and so like every time he hits the field, you get another card, which is really darn cool. Just the one copy, so that if you draw it, he gives you extra bonuses. He's kind of like a Dandylion, but he takes a little bit of time to get to because he's not as accessible as a winged beast. Yeah, you could play like Black Whirlwind and stuff, but at that point you're playing a Black Wing deck, so just the one copy. You could play 3, but I don't like playing more than one of something that's like once per duel. That's why I play the 1 bulb, 1 spore, 1 steam is pretty good. And then randomly, its token is a wind aqua monster, so then that's also different from everything as well. So just a funny thing. Then to finish the main, we're playing a bunch of revival cards. So Soul Charge is busted because not only does it help you build your extra link turn 1, but on top of that, you can set it again with Griffin and then use it again as a backup. So absolutely awesome. Search it with Yugioh, drawing 4 deep into your deck, which is also part of the reason why we go for that Participlants engine, right? Because you're able to go and dig through so much of your deck after you search a lot of pieces out. So like go through all your Lone Fires, go through the O for Scorpio, the �11𝗇𝖑𝖊𝖓𝐵RILLIANT Fusion, the targets for Brilliant Fusion, and then you draw 4. Like you're drawing from a 30 card deck or less, which is pretty darn good, and your shot of getting Soul Charge or one of these other things is pretty good because of that. So then Monster Reborn, this thing is especially good in any Link or Synchro deck. So the fact that we can bring back a Link 3 and turn it into a 4, or a Link 2 and upgrade that is pretty nice, on top of it just being an extender if we need it. So very versatile card, so we obviously play that. And then 2 clones of it are basically 2 copies of World Legacy Succession and 1 Monster Reborn. So Reborn is basically going to be, you hit all 3 Lone Fires from your deck in this deck, and then you're able to go and summon one of them back, which is pretty cool. If you have multiple Link monsters, I suppose you could do that too. If you're able to snipe a Link monster with any of these revival cards, though, it's the rare instance where a revival card will give you a plus in card economy. So normally, you're going to use one of these things and it brings back 1 monster. Okay, great. So it's 1 Link material, right? If I'm holding this in my hand, it counts as 1 card. But in this deck, since you're able to use these guys to bring back Link monsters, anytime you bring back a Link 2, 3, or 4, well, actually 2 or 3, I suppose. 4 is pretty much a dead end there because you can't upgrade to a Link 5 that doesn't exist at this point. You're gaining an additional card essentially by not having to put more cards into a higher link rating. So that's why we play these things. One of this, because Lone Fire is an easy, consistent way to get this thing out. If it's not a Link monster, you can really choose any 3 monsters. If they're Link monsters, ideally you'd make it so the Link monster is one of the hard choices that they don't just automatically vanish, is the big thing. And then that's a once per turn effect, so that's why I only play 1 of those. And then World Legacy Succession is also once per turn, but it's so much easier to resolve because all you need is your main monster zone has to have a link arrow pointing to it, and you can bring anything back there, any position, use all its effects, whatever. So basically playing 2 of these things means you're never really going to dead draw them together, especially with Yugioh. Playing 3 would be a bit cloggy, but playing 2, you just have extra copies of Monster Reborn that's very easy to access. And this thing and all the other revival cards, don't forget, are legal activations when you have 𝗍𝗊 on the board, because 𝗍𝗊 prevents the summoning of anything that's not a Link monster. It doesn't have to be a Link summon, so you can actually go and play these for that as well. So that's the 40 card main deck there. And then the last 4 cards in the extra deck, I basically play 1 Underclock Taker for a couple reasons. 1, this effect is really awesome. You're able to just push for game out of nowhere with it by reducing your opponent's attack. But really, if you look at his arrows, not giving your opponent an arrow and having cardinal directions like this means you can easily extra link cap off with this thing, which is of course that U shape that stops your opponent from summoning anything into their zones, because you took both of them like an evil person. But you could do that. And then we have Tri-Gate Wizard. This thing I don't summon all the time, but usually if you go second, it's pretty good, where you're able to proactively remove one of your opponent's cards, kind of like with Unicorn, but you don't even have to discard. So it's just an option to have. If you go first and you have Soul Charge, then it's an easier card to make, because then you can go and put it into one of the zones that's right below an extra monster slot, and then you can go and link it to 3 and have a negation effect, which is pretty nice. And then that other effect of being able to do additional damage through a co-linked monster, I mean, kind of happens, but realistically I always forget about it. So I don't know, it's just an option. You don't need it, but I think it's one of the better options. And then the last 2 link 4s are Firewall and �11𝖊𝖊𝖊𝖊 Dragon, because Firewall is insane. With this deck, realistically, with all your summons through 𝕮𝖆𝖇𝖑𝖊𝖓, Goblin, and 𝕮𝗓𝐼𝐻, and all the free special summons we have, I'm finding I'm more likely to run out of hand and monsters to summon than I am to actually run out of summons, but Firewall can be used to gain additional summons, could even get you additional monsters to summon, which would be pretty good. And if nothing else, you could just co-link it with some other stuff and then interrupt your opponent that way, which is the main way I like playing it. And then 𝗤𝗏𝒄 is just one of those cards, it's so dumb that you have to play because it will win you games out of nowhere if you play it at the right time, and then if you don't play it, then you will be in situations where it's tough to get rid of some monsters. Because let's say you're playing against a co-link situation, right? The Knightmares, if they have an extra link to you, as long as they don't have Griffin locking you out of the game or anything, you know, 𝗤𝗏𝒄 Dragon is an easy way to get rid of a monster without targeting it by a card effect, destroying it by card effect, or destroying it by battle. So, you know, this is a pretty good out to a lot of things, so definitely get one of these things in here if you can. If you watched the video in its entirety, thanks! Hopefully you guys enjoyed seeing the creation of this deck as much as I did putting this theme together. Again, this is one of those things where I just took a bunch of engines that I used to play, threw them together, I'm like, hey, this works. So it's been a lot of fun to play, and I hope you guys enjoy that as well. The main deck here is 40 cards, and we'll briefly peruse through this. So we have 1 Blackwing Steam the Cloak, triple Destiny Hero Malicious, a Glow Up Bulb, triple Goblindberg, 1 Knightmare Corruptor 𝕿𝖆𝖊𝖊𝖊, triple Lone Fire Blossom, 1 Damage Juggler, triple Hat Tricker, and 1 Trick Clown. Then we have double Darlingtonia Cobra, triple Ophrys Scorpio, triple Reborn Tengu, 1 Red-Haired Hasty Horse, 1 Spore, and then double Gemknight Garnet for our monsters. Then for spells, we have triple Brilliant Fusion, 1 Foolish Burial, an Instant Fusion, a 1-for-1, Monster Reborn, Monster Reborn Reborn, then Soul Charge, and a double World Legacy Succession for a 40-card main deck. And then in our extra deck of 15, we have a single link 1 in Knightmare Mermaid. Then we have 𝗵 World Chalice Priestess, Knightmare Cerberus, Goblin, Phoenix, and Underclock Taker as our link 2s. Then we have Knightmare Unicorn and Trigate Wizard as link 3s. 𝗤𝗏𝒄 Dragon, Firewall Dragon, Knightmare Griffin, and 𝕮𝗆𝖇𝖑𝖊𝒄 Skulldread as link 4s. Naturia Beast as our only synchro. And then we have our Karbonala Warrior for instant fusion and Gemknight 𝕮𝗓𝐻 for brilliant fusion. That's the end of this video, but if you'd like to see more of this series, you can click the annotation on the right, or you can see the last video I did by clicking the one on the left. If you enjoyed, I encourage you guys to leave a like and share it with others you think who may enjoy it as well. And if you'd really like to see more updates, then subscribe to JDGaming for more Yu-Gi-Oh videos. Thanks guys, this is JDGaming, hope you guys enjoyed as always, and I'll see you guys next time.